Welcome to another episode of the Mideast News Hour. Over the past couple of years, actually, or more, we've heard more and more reports about actions taken by Israeli Arabs that are nationalistic in their character and rebellious. We saw a spasm of violence. It wasn't really a spasm, but open, organized cooperation among Israeli Arabs and Hamas in May 2021 during the Guardian of the Walls operation against Hamas in Gaza. We saw riots, organized riots by Arab Israelis in mixed Arab-Jewish towns throughout the country, lynching of Jewish Israelis by their Arab neighbors, the burning of Jewish businesses by Arabs in Arab Israeli towns. We saw takeovers of highway arteries, traffic arteries throughout the country by rioting Arab Israelis. Then in May 2021, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett and Benny Gantz formed a government with the Muslim Brotherhood Party in the Knesset, Ram, and we've seen other things. But one of the people who has been talking about something new happening in the Israeli Arab community, happening new and bad, is retired Brigadier General Effi Eitam, and he's my guest today on the News Hour, and we're going to talk about what he sees happening among Israeli Arabs and what it all means going forward into the elections and then into the coming year and years to come. So first of all, without further ado, Effi Eitam, thank you very much for joining me this week on the News Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's really a pleasure. You spoke, I think it was last week, you gave a warning. You said, and not for the first time, you said it last year as well, that what you're seeing happening on the ground is that Israeli Arabs are actually building an army under our noses. Can you talk a little bit about, or a lot, in fact, about what it is that you see and why it is that you're concluding that what you're seeing indicates that they're building an army?
I think that we have to look at the model of the buildup of the State of Israel and far beyond that, the IDF, its armed forces, at the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel. And I think that in many other areas, they are following the steps of Zionist movement in its very beginning. They follow these steps in order to defeat Zionism and the State of Israel by using its own weapons, if we can use these words. First, the motivation. The motivation is there, combined out of two main sources, roots, ideological sources. One comes from the Islamic part of the Arab society, which turned to be very strong. If I try to remember the number of mosques, the number of women with the burqa, and the use of religious Islamic terminology among the Israeli Arabs, let's say 20, 25, 30 years ago, everyone who has open ears, open eyes, understand that the Islamic argumentation, the Islamic terminology and epistemology turned to be the main tool and the leading voice amongst the Israeli Arabs, and those who had any hopes out of creating a barrier against radicalism by the face of, I would say, intellectual and academic education, happened to be very wrong and disappointed, because on the contrary, those who are more highly educated and more sophisticated and more open to the voices coming out of the society, out of the Arab society here in Israel, they realized that academic education not only that didn't create a barrier, but appeared to be an accelerator to those kind of Islamic radicalism, and this is one source. Israel is.
Can I ask you just one question about what you were saying? Because it seems to me that there are two aspects of motivation. One is Islamic, like you said, and the other one.
I'm coming to this. You're right. One is Islam, and the other one is coming from the West by the legitimation of a national state in general, and the national state, the state of Israel in specific. And this liberalism, progressivism, joining hands with radical Islam to delegitimate the state of Israel, those are the main two sources, while the motivation is coming and reinforced now more than ever by the combination of those two streams. And in an odd way, which is needed more time to explain, it's the campuses and the academic liberalism and progressivism coming from the West, especially from America now, and the radical Islam are creating a perfect storm as far as the motivation, the hope, and the justification of delegitimate the state of Israel as the major frame through which we all are supposed to live and to cooperate through. So this is the motivation. Now, the other level is the organization. I mean, you can have a motivation, but you don't have an organization, and people say, okay, they might not like us, they might hate the state of Israel, they might delegitimate the state of Israel, but they don't have the organization, the units, the frames to organize themselves through a military effective activity. And again, a great mistake. The organizations are there far before the state of Israel was established. Those are the chamulas, the families, the tribes, which were functioning as the units in the great rebel of the Arabs against the British at the 30s, and then they were the most effective units, or I would say, yes, units and organizations through which they carried out the military and operational activity against the state of Israel in its very early days at the independent war, and that have not disappeared. We have to remember that the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those people are sitting on the knees of their grandfathers, and they hear about the heroic war that was the battle was lost, and the Zionism was winning in the first round, but the motivation and the heritage of fighting and winning and carrying out the holy mission of destroying the state of Israel and delegitimate its very existence is much stronger than all what Israel offered and might offer as far as standard of living, as far as infrastructure, as far as personal security. That is nothing, and it's melt against this motivation and organizations through which the Hamul is turning to be semi-military units. Now training, I mean, everyone remember that the Palmach and the Haganah, when they have been established at the very beginning, they needed to train. So they went to all kinds of forests and remote places and trained themselves while the British were here, and it was illegal. They train themselves. Everyone who traveled, especially at nights, in the Negev, in the Galilee, he can hear, and this is my old soldier ear that can hear that it's not a fantasia, it's not a shooting in weddings just for kind of ritual purposes. It's training. They shoot, they use weapons which were stolen in hundreds of thousands, especially from the IDF, but also smuggled through the borders. Not tanks, not Air Force yet, but if you think about how easy it is today to buy a drone and to fly it illegally, legally over the airspace of Israel, you can understand that the day of having vertical dimension, I would say, especially drones in this army which is built now, is not very far. So the weapons are there, the units are there, motivation and heritage is there, and now you have to have many people who experience killing. Killing is something that normal people, normal citizens are not experienced, and they are very much, I would say, deterred from using power, especially killing, because murdering is something that you don't do as a normative citizens, and you might suffer some heavy punishments. But when you cross it, and not one or two or three or four, but thousands of people are involved in killing, directly, indirectly, they support the murderers, then a society with the fear of killing, the fear of murdering, disappear. And when that disappears, you have a perfect soldier. He is part of a unit, tribe, family, chamula. He is well equipped with the state of the art weapons, which were stolen directly from the hands of a modern army like the IDF. They are trained, they are committed, they experience killing, and then not immediately, slowly, step by step, an army emerge. Because think about the Haganah, think about the Etzel and the Lehi. It was prepared in a cover, but at the moment it was needed, it appeared as a very effective, trained, well-equipped organization. That's what happened. Now, we have to remember that this kind of progress, this kind of process, the buildup of this army enjoy also two more elements which make it, provided a perfect kind of a cover. First, it's Israeli citizens. So they enjoy protections and innocence of being normative citizens. So everything they do fall first into the category of criminal activity. Criminal activity means it's not a threat for the state. It's not a threat from the rule of law. It's not a mortal threat from the state to the state apparatus order. So it's very hard. You need a very comprehensive view and understanding of the phenomena in order to identify that an army is built. Citizens, they can be nervous, they can lose some control, they can kill some neighbors that they hate, but it's nothing which really represent a national problem, which needs entirely different approach and interference. Both the police, the army, and the legal authorities that represent something that a state can identify as as a national problem. This is one thing, and it's very important to understand that because of that, it's become a kind of threat, a kind of a problem that it's very hard to identify what the real potential of this to the very existence of the state of Israel. It's also enjoy a kind of confusion. Who is about to deal with that? Who is about to assess the progress and the threat coming out of that? It's not the army. It's also not the police, because the police deal with criminals. The army deals with external enemies. It could have been and should have been the Shabak, the General Security Agency. Service. But the Shabak is so occupied with what happened in Judah and Samaria and what happened in Gaza. So they prefer to ignore it. For many, many years, they preferred to ignore it because they couldn't really bring themselves into a mind state of telling the people in Israel, the leaders, the politicians, yes, the idea of having the Israeli Arabs shifting into the democratic system and turning to be normative citizens in a democratic Jewish state failed. That is so bitter and so dramatic as far as maybe one of the most fundamental decisions that the state of Israel did after the independent war. In other words, to provide all the Israeli Arabs who live in Israel full civilian rights, and hoping that along the time with high standard of living, with high standard of civil rights, they will give up their destructive intentions as far as the long future of the state of Israel. And it's very hard to come and say it's failed. And we need to tell ourselves the very truth. It's failed. And the greatest failure is not that this army cannot be, defeated and cannot be treated by the Israeli defense forces. But the greatest failure is that this minority and the experience we launched when we established the state of Israel, telling the world and ourselves that yes, they are not Israelis, they are not Jewish, but they will turn to be very contributing minority that can really enjoy full civilian rights. I think that what we see now, the narrative of we are Israeli Palestinians, which many, many years was not even mentioned. It was in the background, maybe something. Now it is said clear and loud, we are Israeli Palestinians. Other words, we represent the Palestinian dreams, intention, interest within the state of Israel, within its democratic system. And no doubt that it brings the state of Israel, no matter if you are left or right, it brings the state of Israel as the fulfillment of the Jewish people dream, desire, and request for having a state of their own, a national state of their own, into a very critical junction. We'll have to decide if we want a state of all its citizens or a Jewish state where some minorities can enjoy very high standard of living, very high standard of civilian rights, even personal security, but not and cannot be involved anymore as equals in determining what the future of the Jewish revolution, Jewish state will be. And
You know, you're touching on something here, and obviously what you're saying is extraordinarily disturbing.
a little bit louder.
I said, obviously what you're saying is very disturbing. And you're touching on something here that I think is it's being discussed not only in Israel, but also in other countries, and including in the United States. And our colleague and friend Yoram Chazoni just wrote a new book called Rediscovering Conservatism, where his argument basically, and I'm going to have him on the show as well to talk about it, but essentially is that, you know, there is a national character to a state, and that the deal that in the United States in particular that conservatives made with libertarians to try to build a big tent for conservative policy making really handicapped it, because the libertarians came in and said, look, you know, so long as you're not bothering anybody, you can do whatever you want, and we're not going to interfere. And what government has to do is take itself out of people's lives as much as possible. And here, and Israel also said, look, we give maximum personal autonomy to our people, you know, in whether it's in free market capitalism, or it's in allowing people maximum expression, and as Arab Israelis, as Palestinian Israelis, and being extremely tolerant of differences. But in the end, what it did was it empowered people who want to annihilate Israel and replace it with something else. You did just mention one thing that I want to go back and ask you about, because it also just gets in, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But one of the things, what I just said, I want you to respond, but you said a couple of things when you were introducing the problem that I'm not really clear on. Particularly, you talk about you said you need motivation, which they have. You need an organization, and so I had a couple of questions, both about the organizational frameworks and also about the killing. So regarding the organizational frameworks, I'm not really clear what you mean when you say that they're using the tribal frameworks. I mean, there are a lot of different frameworks in Arab Israeli society. There are tribes. I think that they're much more powerful social forces among Bedouins in the Negev than among the city dwellers in the Galilee. And I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to understand the primacy of them. When you look at other organizational constructs, you have all kinds of the higher committee of ועדת המעקב של ערביי ישראל. Right, so it's the follow-up higher committee of Arab Israelis, that they play a role. You have all of these Western funded NGOs, Arab NGOs, that are involved in undermining the work of the state, the enforcement of law towards Arab Israelis by Israeli authorities. So I want to talk about, so I'm trying to understand the organizational framework, and then I also have a question about the killing. But if you can just first explain really, and of course then you have the Arab political organizations. You have all the various political parties that are represented in local politics and that are represented in national politics. And you also have the intervention and the active involvement of Arab states, and not to mention the Palestinians, which we obviously have to get into as well. Maybe that's in the killing part, but of Jordan, that's massively funding a lot of these political parties and different organizations, and also Qatar, that's funding a lot of the irredentist operations of the nationalistic and Islamic operations inside of Arab-Israeli society. So just talk a little bit more about what we're looking at organizationally, about the relationship also between the Hamulot and all of these outside organizations that are much more easy for me to follow as an outsider.
I think that your question is very good, and I think it's need a little bit more time than we have now to give a very deep analysis of these contradicting forces within the Arab-Israeli society. But we have to remember what are the real foundation of the structure of this society, and they're not about to change. This is the family, the Hamula, in its broad meaning, not the nuclear family, father, mother, and children, but it's the family in its broad meaning, and the tribe. Those are the most fundamental coordinates which make every Arab in general and the Israeli Arabs in specific. Those are the coordinates through which he defined himself. And also there is the territorial element, the land, the village. Even when they move into some urban areas, they still keep it by names, by mentality. We don't identify that very well, except as very trained experts, but it's there. And by the way, one of the reasons that we see the urban process in the Israeli Arab society so very slow, they still build their homes on their land with some olive trees around, and the state of Israel could have made the standard of living much higher and even easier and save a lot of land by building modern tall buildings, but they don't. When I was the Minister of Housing and Construction, we offered some of the villages which turned out to be small towns and cities to build some tall buildings. There was a refusal to buy apartments there, so we stopped it. But those are the foundations of the society. Now, what happened, and of course, above all this, although the Bedouins were a little bit of an exception, but Arabs in general, it's the Islamic umbrella, which in a way become again one more dimension of their of the way they identified themselves. Now, what happened was very, very interesting, because the Arab states at the early 50s, 60s, until some at the 80s, they in a way adapted a national, Western national ideology. In Egypt, even in Syria, in Iraq, some of it was communist, some of this was socialist, but they adapted all kind of political thought and used political terminology which was not their original terminology. And then what happened was the burst up of all these national states in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, and the wake up and the emerge of forces which were very much committed to the Islamic dimension. Now, what happened here amongst the Israeli Palestinians was that they grew up under and nearby the political thought of Israel, and in a way they had some feelings, and they were educated in Haifa University or some other places, that they need to use this terminology in order to be to be considered as modern people who their arguments can be heard. And now this conflict between their fundamental, original, natural coordinates which identify them, and between what have been imported through this kind of liberal revolution and the contact with liberal institutions, that create now a kind of confusion and conflict within the Israeli-Palestinian society. I predict that at the end of the day, they will reject all the idea of democracy, all the idea of civil rights, which they already reject. They use it now because it's served for great extent their arguments against the state of Israel, but amongst themselves, they don't respect civil rights and civil liberal civil thought whatsoever. So I believe that radicalism amongst the Palestinian, Israeli Palestinians will go far and far, and it will, at the end, it will be dressed with the original Islamic fundamentalism and will join hands, as it's already happened so intensively, with the most radical Islamic forces around us. If we shall deal with that so softly and so tolerantly as we did so far, we will have Gaza in Beersheba will be surrounded by Gazian environment, and the same thing with the Galilee, and there are many signs that it's already happening. So
which makes me want to go first. Let me just, I want to go.
The political parties and the Vadat Ma'akav and all these institutions which were built in order to moderate the Islamic core of the Israeli Arabs are about to fail at the end. To surrender, the Islamic radicalism.
I just want to go back to the killing thing, because obviously that's kind of the tip of the iceberg for most Israelis when we see the violence, when we're watching it and watching it unfold. So there are a lot of things here. I mean, when you were talking about the anti-liberal, the authoritarian mindset of the leadership of the Arab Israelis, so we're already seeing, and there have already been, exposés of this, that they're not turning to Israeli law enforcement when they have a conflict, when somebody carries out a crime among Arabs, that they're going more to their independent justice. They have their own self-operating court system that they've developed over time, particularly in the Negev, where they essentially reject Israelis' national authorities, that they're not, that there were, I don't even know if it's a boycott, it's a choice to just opt out of the system. They've built parallel justice systems in their own villages, in their own tribes, and they're using them instead. So they're settling everything inside of their own organizations. And then they also have, when you're talking about killing, but wait, and then there's another level of that, which is that, the left in Israel in particular has been limiting, and we see this very clearly with the Bennett, Lapid, Gantz government, that they're constantly talking about bringing down the level of criminality among Israeli Arabs, and they never attribute to the criminality any nationalistic angle, that they always look at it as, oh, it's just these poor women who are being murdered in honor killings by their brothers or their fathers or their cousins, and they never, they ignore and keep out of the discourse the question of what are you talking about when you're talking about criminal activity among Israeli Arabs. And then I just want to add two more observations that have been becoming very clear. One is, we've had all of these sightings, like almost every day you see young Arab men walking around with T-shirts that have iron-ons, that have the insignia, a big M16 on the back or on the front, and people have really taken issue with these young Arab men walking around with these T-shirts, and I'm wondering whether you think that this is a uniform or a signal of some sort, that they're part of the military organization that you hear training every night. And then the other question that I had was, for many years, 15 years, if not more, we've had growing criminal syndicates of Arab Israelis, Bedouin Israelis, Arabs, villagers in the Galilee that are conducting mass sabotage of the extortion rings against Israeli farmers, burning crops, stealing livestock on a whole-scale basis. You have Israeli shopkeepers from one end of the country to the other who are compelled to pay protection to Arab gangs. You even have the Jewish National Fund that operates Israel's forests in the south and in the north have been paying protection to these Arab criminal gangs who threaten to or burn down parts of the forests and then say that they'll come in and provide security for the forest if national institutions of Israel will pay them protection. So we even have national institutions like the JNF paying protection to these criminal syndicates. What is the connection between them? So I've asked you three questions. I've asked whether you think that those M16 T-shirts are some sort of a signal or a uniform. And then I've asked you the broader question about the nexus between the criminality and the militarism. And then I asked you a third question, which now I suddenly can't remember. So if you can just suffice with two, that would be good.
I think that first, I would say that the way that the state of Israel phrase and explain itself what happened around through.
Oh yeah, the government. That was the first question, was the way that we explain the problem to ourselves.
The government, yes. And I would say the governments, most of the governments in the last 3 decades were looking at this process first with an unbelievable strategic lack of strategic understanding. They really wanted to tell themselves all kinds of false stories for a long time. The only way we can justify or explain that blindness is first the astonishment from and the disappointment from the fail of the experiment. As you said, we were such a enlightened state that we allowed people who were part of our enemies at the independent war, at the first steps of ourselves as a state, in the most bitter, crucial moments of our very existence, overnight, those who didn't run away, we hugged them and adopted them and invited them and opened the doors as wide as can be to them and offered them to be equal citizens. That was a very, I would say, a very courageous, noble experiment. And Israel really did with whatever she had. You know, remember that we have millions of immigrants during these years, and we shared with the Arabs, and I invite everyone. I traveled yesterday amongst the Arab villages in the Galil, Elabun, Dir Hana, Sakhnin, and Arabit. It's unbelievable. I mean, most of the people live in huge villas, huge homes. The infrastructure is much better than in my moshav. The roads are good. The gardening is nice, and all this story of them being discriminated and the unfair sharing of the state wealth it's a lie. It's a lie, and the disappointment and the feeling of that we in a way were cheated by the Arab minority, and they turn us bad for so many good things that we did. That was the first gap between what the eyes and the ears heard and saw and what was the explanation. And that's not only left governments, it's the Israeli political establishment in general that couldn't believe to that kind of
They were ungrateful, ingratitude.
How?
Ingratitude.
Ingratitude.
They were ungrateful.
Of those Israeli Arabs. And not only this gratitude, they became an irredential minority. They join hands in every case with our enemies, close and far enemies, and adapted all the terminologies, the most radical Islamic ideas. So that was one thing. The other thing is that more time passed, this kind of Gordic, right? Gordic connection ties, Gordian
knot.
Gordian tie became something that they didn't know how to untie, how to open, how to make that operation and leave the two parts alive. So fear prevailed. Fear prevailed. It's a problem that we don't know how to deal with. We have no power. We have no legal frame to deal with that. Israeli citizens equal. And in a way, a pessimism as far as the capability of the state of Israel effectively to deal with that became something that almost every government, I was a minister in 3 governments, with Arik Sharon, but the idea that this problem has got to be dealt as a strategic challenge was never really took place. On top of that was, of course, the liberal ideology and the liberal Israeli Jewish political forces, which made it almost impossible to put first the facts and the problem on the table before dealing with what solutions must be or should be. It became a taboo for every a politician in Israel who wants not to be accused as a fascist. Don't deal with that. Don't mention the problem with Israeli Arabs. We will have to live with that, and really God knows what will happen and how we do that. And more the weight of this delegitimation within Israel itself. In the Knesset, all these speeches about how criminal the Israeli army is, all the claims for land, which was the nation and state land as something that they own or should get, the support from the Supreme Court of Justice in so many cases. That's and now we come to a moment of truth. And if we shall continue to deal with the question as a problem of criminality, that will continue to move forward under this cover. And at the end, we shall find, and we have already have an enemy with Israeli identity cards, with Israeli present as part of the Jewish state, Jewish people, and in a way that's something that needs so much courage. Even this interview, even this podcast, which I tell you what I think, might be a kind of might be used against me, and to continue a very long process of delegitimation, which I absorb. I'm very trained. I'm not afraid. But think about a politician who just start now his first steps in politics, and he needs the media and the academy to legitimize him, to invite him to all kinds of conferences, to interview him. Then he will use all kind of double language. He will speak from both sides of his lips, and he will maneuver, and at the end he will not be able, and so far that would happen, to gather the courage and the unity and the power which is needed to deal with existential problems as states sometimes needs to face.
You know, I mean, I think that first of all, I think that I have to thank you because
I don't hear you.
I'm sorry. I said, first of all, I want to thank you for speaking so candidly about this, because I mean, and that's obviously why I had you on, because you know, and you're right. And just so you guys know, watching out there, one of the reasons I wanted Effi on today was because I'm curious. I wanted to know what he has to say. I want to understand what these nighttime training sessions are, because if you go on Google, and in Hebrew, it's not even in English, and I put your name in and I say Arab army, nothing comes up. And then, you know, like last week, he gets on the news with the headline, "The Arabs are training an army, the Israeli Arabs." But then as soon as you give the headline, they ask you about other stuff. And so I didn't actually, I mean, maybe I missed an interview or two, but I didn't see any detail about this incredibly terrifying concept that this is what's happening among our neighbors here in Israel, and we have to be aware of it. And I think that this is absolutely the most important thing. And you know, just to get the basis of what's going on with the Israeli Arabs, we've already spent most of the hour. So I want to just have a final question with you, which is about the elections. You know, now the central argument that the Likud and the right-wing bloc are making against the left, and that the left are sort of making against the right, is whether we should have Arab-Israeli parties in the next coalition government. And so the right wing is saying absolutely not, and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz do not have a government without these very radical Arab parties. And then you see this maneuvering on the part of the left, Meretz, who's jockeying to raise the Arab voter turnout, and Yair Lapid, and it's not really clear what they're doing, but basically they split up the Joint Arab List into two parties. You have Ram, the Muslim Brotherhood, that's already been running on its own since the last election, and now you have what was left of the consortium of three parties. They've broken into two blocks where you have Balad, which is sort of the Israeli Ba'athist party that's running on its own, that's controlled by Qatar through its former head, Azmi Boushara, who lives in Doha. And then you have the other two parties, which is sort of the PLO party led by Yasser Arafat's former advisor and the head of the Arab Communist Party, which has called for Arabs to leave the police force, and pure irredentism. And Ayman Uda goes to the United States, speaks to American Jewish communities about how terrible American Jewish support for Israel is and why Israel should be boycotted. So you have these three parties now running: the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ba'athist Party and the PLO Communist Party are running. And the question is whether to have a government with the Islamic Brotherhood and the PLO Communist Party in them or not. How do you look at this, at what has happened as a result of the Muslim Brotherhood being a member of the outgoing government's coalition and the prospect of seeing the other Arab parties in a new government to be formed after the elections?
I think that for many, many years, actually, maybe one exception with the Rabin government, minority government, which was supported by Arabs from the outside, by the way. They were not part of the coalition government. But for many, many years, no matter what the governments were, I mean, I don't speak about the radical left in Israel, but all the other government, the Labour government and the Likud government, always, I mean, it was a kind of understanding that in order to maintain the Israeli Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs in the Israeli political system as legitimate parties, they need to be kept out of the government. They can vote, they can be in the Knesset, but they cannot be part of the ruling coalition in Israel. That was exclusively kept for Jewish Zionist parties. They can be more left, they can be more right, but they are still under the definition of Zionist, Jewish Zionist parties. What happened with Bennett is not only that he spoiled and contaminated the idea of the democracy representing the will of the majority of the voters. There should be a limit even to the coalition manipulation that can hide behind the idea of this is the majority, or the will of the majority of it. It's not that's not the problem. The problem is that he first time opened the door for anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish Hamas party and brought them into the ruling system in Israel. That broke something so fundamental and so important, and that was a consensus among all the governments in Israel since it was established. And it was the only way, people have to understand, that was the only way to keep Arabs, Israeli Palestinians in the political system and not create a kind of a crisis that Israel will have to choose them or them in as a legitimate part of the ruling system in Israel, and that will bring Israel to become a state of all citizens by definition. It's not a matter of the numbers, it's by definition. It's not anymore the state of the Jewish people. Jewish people have no any advantage, and Jewish will, Jewish have not any more superiority over other parts of other groups in the Israeli society. That became a kind of equality that is the heart and the soul of a state of all its citizens. That's what Bennett did, but he was so eager to fulfill his ego dreams and desires that he was ready to destroy everything. That will be, it's not by chance, I think, that now it's very clear that the Likud make it very clear. I think that Benny Gantz also made it very clear that parties Arab parties will not be part of the government. But it's not a taboo anymore. It's not an obstacle that cannot be penetrated. And thanks to Bennett, that very destructive option became real. Now, first, what we need to do, and I think that Arabs, Israeli, Palestinians have to understand that if that red line will not be redrawn and will not be put again as a real red line that cannot be changed, although cannot what?
Cannot be crossed, yes. Yeah.
Yes, although it's not a law, although it's in something the Supreme Court of Justice might not agree, but that was de facto the smartness of the founding fathers after they made that tremendous mistake of bringing our enemies into the cradle of the of the moment of birth of the state when Israel was established. But they created a kind of modus operandi, a status quo, which made it possible to run the day-to-day life of Israel by excluding Arab parties from being part of the ruling system. If that will not redrawn, there will be a deep crisis amongst the Israeli society as far as the legitimation of such kind of a government to declare a war, to take taxes, and to make decisions which are on the national level. So I think that the coming election are very important. They're very important in many aspects, but in this aspect of redrawing and reshaping a ruling system in Israel, other words, the coalition government, it can be from Merav Michaeli to Ben-Gvir, but it's this element of Arab parties, anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli, can be excluded out of this kind of coalition party potential. By the way, it was again the Supreme Court of Justice who had to be the guard in the gate and not allow such kind of parties like Balad and like Abbas party from participating in the election, because democracy should have limits and should have the right to defend the national character and the national nature of the state which the democracy functions in. And if it does not do that, if it does provide power to those who want to destroy this character of the state, then democracy become a hollow slogan, a hollow game. So for me, it's very important who will be the next prime minister. But for me, what was supposed to be obvious until the last election, until the last government, that whatever happened, we shall not surrender this pressure, even to get some minor majority. We shall not surrender this pressure and bring in irredentic elements which are not anymore anonymous or come through a kind of a cover. They come with a flag of destroying the state of Israel, the Jewish state, very high in front of them.
I agree. All right, well, Effi, I think we're going to have to leave it at that because we're running out of time, and I think that any further question that I ask you is just going to end up having a discussion that's going to go out for another 2 or 3 hours, so that we can't do this. But I will have you back, and I want to talk specifically with you also about the other aspect, which I had been hoping to talk to Effi about today, which was why it is that his appointment to be the director of Yad Vashem was undermined by the Israeli left. And I think it's all very much part of the same nexus of progressivism and Islamism that he was talking about, that you've been talking about in terms of Israeli Arabs, and that is a much broader subject in terms of trying to hide or undermine or sabotage Israel's Jewish character, and also the history of the Jewish people as it unfolded in Europe over the years, and also in the Middle East. But that'll be for another day. And in the meantime, I just want to thank you very much for coming forward and telling us, because obviously, we all know that if we don't know what's happening, we're never going to be able to build policies or strategies for survival that will work, because you simply can't build anything based on denial of the truth. We saw this, we continue to see this with the Palestinians, and increasingly we're having the same problem with Arab Israelis. So I thank you, and I want to wish you Chag Sameach, Shana Tova. May the coming year really bring us wisdom and courage to handle the very difficult problems that we're facing today. Thank you. Thank you.
I agree, and just let me first recommend in front of our audience the book of Yoram Hazony. I think that it's a very important book, and it's very important because what is written there, but because it's written in English and it's coming from America. And those ideas coming from America, the understanding that America collapsed and America is losing its power from the ideas which we have just discussed. In Israel, it has the Israeli specific face, but the ideas are not only here. And they destroy national states, national armies, national motivation, national heritage all around. Europe is almost non-existent anymore. America is getting weaker and weaker. And by following what happened there in those two continents, we can understand that if we don't open our eyes and recruit courage, first to say what the problem, and then to think about the strategy, then as you said, we might face a catastrophe. And I want to thank you personally, being my friend, and Yoram Hazony being my friend, and for your great contribution, raising such a wonderful, powerful, and courageous voice, while so many people are living in kind of very well orchestrated and financed blindness and lies. Thank you. Shana Tova.
So what we're seeing today, what I think one of, obviously the picture that Effi Eitam just painted or demonstrated really by what's happening among Israeli Arabs and the unwillingness of Israelis to our leaders, our elites to acknowledge reality, let alone do anything about it. It does go very clearly to what the central campaign issue is today as we go forward into the November 1st elections, and that is whether Israel is going to remain a Jewish state or whether it's going to become a post-Jewish state that ends up being subsumed into an Arab nationalist narrative that rejects Jewish rights to the land of Israel, Jewish history of the land of Israel, and the Jewish peoplehood and the Jewish people's existence and its right to self-determination. In other words, whether we're going to be living in an Israel that is governed by the PLO charter, or whether we're going to be governed by the Jewish people on the basis of our laws. And here I think this goes back to what he was talking about, the High Court of Justice in Israel and its role and the role of the legal fraternity in enabling this very dangerous phenomenon that we're seeing now reaching military proportions with the Arab-Israeli community to expand and really to explode in March of 2021 in the riots and the pogroms that were carried out in concert with Hamas and its missile offensive against Israel in May of 2021. Because as he said, under Israeli law, political parties that reject Israel's right to exist and that support terrorism are not allowed to run for the Knesset for obvious reasons. You cannot give national authority for lawmaking to people who reject the right of the state to exist. It makes no sense and it's impossible. And this, by the way, I just want to say a sentence about the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, which paved the way for the League of Nations mandate and then for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, made very clear distinction. They said that the national rights to the land of Israel were reserved for the Jews and that all the other residents of the land could receive full religious and civil rights, legal rights, but that the right to determine the national character of the state belonged only to the Jews, that the Jews had a right to build our state in the land of Israel. And this is the legal basis in international law still today for the existence of a Jewish state. And of course, there's a historical basis, but just from an international legal perspective. And so that concept that only Jews have the right to national rights is also the basis of Israel's legal structure. So when the Supreme Court overturned the Knesset's election committee's decision in previous iterations and enabled Arab parties that do not accept Israel's right to exist and that side with Israel's enemies and their war to annihilate the Jewish state and to carry out terrorist warfare against the state of Israel, they undermined the very basis of the state of Israel, and they essentially annulled the Balfour Declaration. So it was an illegal act by Israel's Supreme Court that they breached Israel's own basic laws about the Knesset, and then the basic fundamental understanding of what it means to be a Jewish state by allowing these irredentist parties to take over, and then they seized the balance of power for reasons that have to do with the pathologies of the left and breakaway members of right-wing parties like Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, who refused to serve under Netanyahu, refused to accept the judgment of Likud voters that they want Benjamin Netanyahu to be prime minister. And so that gave the Arab parties that are illegal under Israeli law, but have been legalized unlawfully in breach of law by Israel's Supreme Court justices to participate in the elections. And this brings me to my final, where I wanted to go with my final statement, which is that, I don't know what we do in general. If we face an insurrection, an insurgency of Arab Israelis who have all the arms that they've smuggled in from Jordan and from Gaza, and that they've stolen from IDF bases over the years, how this gets fought, what sort of structure or unit structure in the IDF we need to build. They've been talking about building a National Guard. What would that involve? Who would be in it? That's a separate question that we can look at in a future discussion with the military people who are working on this issue. But I believe that the first place that we have to start is reform of our legal system, and the reassertion of the power to determine Israel's laws to the lawmakers, to the Knesset, and to take it away from our justices who have seized power that they have not gained from our lawmakers to dictate policy, dictate national policy, dictate what can be law, how we're supposed to interpret laws that are very clear, that don't need interpretation, like the law that says that parties that reject Israel's right to exist and support our enemies aren't allowed to run for office, run for the Knesset. And I think, and also that what we're seeing now is a breakdown of the rule of law because of our legal are the leaders of our legal fraternity and the outsized power of the state prosecution and the justices of the Supreme Court that they've seized unlawfully from the Knesset and from the government. And they've made a decision that law cannot be equally enforced towards Jews and Arabs, that Israel's legal system is siding with Arabs who seize government lands, build illegal structures on them, saying that they have a right to keep that land that they've seized, and that Israel can't enforce its laws about land seizure, illegal building towards the Bedouins in the south and the Arab communities in the north, the same way that they enforce the laws towards Israeli Jews. And once we have proper enforcement of laws, it's the same with the tax laws. And carrying firearms unlawfully. I think that the way that you start to deal with a restive, irredentist population that rejects Israel's right to exist, that is organizing itself as a separate political entity under our noses and building an army, as Effi Eitam has revealed, is to simply assert the power of the state, not in a draconian way, but in the exact same way that the state asserts its power towards Israeli Jews. That is going to lead you in a direction. We have to understand that reality is always dynamic. And when you take an action that advances your national interests, for instance, you apply Israeli law across the board entirely, exactly the same way towards Jews and Arabs, it puts you in a different position. And you're in that position and things have already changed. And then you have to look from the new position that you're in to try to figure out what you have to do next. And solutions appear once you start down that virtuous road of actually restoring your national authority towards your Arab population. Then you see that you've already begun to change things. And that's what the next government of Israel is going to be charged with doing. That's going to be one of its central tasks, is to begin the process. In fact, to enact the process, not to begin, it's too late in the game, but to actively enforce Israeli laws without discrimination towards Jews and Arabs in this country equally. If that happens, then we're going to develop a new dynamic, and that new dynamic is going to present us with new questions. If we have a government that is formed by Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, and I don't care what Benny Gantz or Gideon Sa'ar says now when they're under stress, they have no option other than to form a government with the Arab parties. It's obvious, it's just the math. They don't have any ability to form a government without the Arabs, if they continue, obviously, to boycott Netanyahu and the Likud. Without Netanyahu and the Likud, they cannot form a government without the Arabs, and they will form a government with the Arabs. So the question is, who is going to form the next government? What is the next government going to look like? Is it going to be a government led by the Likud that's going to be controlled by the right-wing bloc? Or is it going to be a government that is formed by Lapid and Gantz and rest on the support of these Arab parties that under Israeli law, forget about what the ruling of the justices was, under Israeli law, are not allowed to be in the Knesset because they are enemies of the state of Israel and define themselves as such, then we are going to be eclipsed, and we're going to be a state of all of its citizens. And Jews, Effi wrongly used the term superiority. It's not superiority. Again, it goes back to the Balfour Declaration, to the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, to our basic laws, and to the whole concept of Zionism, that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Israel is the expression of the success of the Zionist revolution. Its purpose is to ensure the Jewish people's sovereignty in our national homeland, which we are endowed with by our right to national self-determination and by our historic rights to this country, to this land. And the Balfour Declaration recognizes that. It says that the national rights to the land of Israel are reserved only for the Jewish people, for the establishment of their nation state, and all of the other citizens in the nation, in the nation state of the Jewish people, have equal legal rights, equal religious rights, but not the right to national self-determination. Are we going to maintain that, or are we going to lose it? Because you can't have it both ways. I disagree with one thing that Effi told us, which is that he apparently, perhaps in retrospect, thinks that Ben-Gurion's decision to give the equal rights to Arab Israelis was wrong. That's not true. The reason why we've gotten into this pickle, yes, it's the nexus of Islamism and progressivism, absolutely, and our embarrassment at applying our national identity as we have our full rights to do, is we're here in order to do towards Arab Israelis. But if the progressives hadn't joined in an alliance with Islamists, and if the progressives hadn't then subverted the Israeli left from the outside and also from our academia, then we would have still not been in a problem here. And the only way not to be in this problem any longer is to stop giving unfair treatment, unfair so-called affirmative action to Arabs, and actually applying our law without discrimination towards Jews and Arabs. This is going to be the challenge of the next government if it's formed. And again, if a right-wing government under Netanyahu is not formed, then I don't see how we move on from here as a Jewish state. If you have another Israeli-Palestinian government leading this country, then our Jewish character is going to be sacrificed. And that's really what's on the scales this time around. And we'll join you for one more show before Rosh Hashanah, but I'll still say, in case you don't join in next week, or we may put it out late this week, we'll have to see. We'll say Shana Tova, and again, may the coming year be a year where we have the courage and we have the government capable of protecting this country, and the courage to do what we need in order to secure our national survival as a Jewish state for posterity. So thank you very much, Shana Tova Metuka, and we'll see you later.